I thought moving into a quiet suburban neighborhood would finally give me some peace. The kind of peace you imagine when you see white picket fences and freshly mowed lawns. My wife loved the place, the neighbors were polite enough, and for the most part it was everything we wanted. Little did I know that peace had a name: Karen. Karen was the type of person who measured the world in perfectly trimmed hedges, mailbox paint shades, and whether or not the correct number of decorative stones lined your flower bed. She was, without exaggeration, the ultimate HOA enforcer, self-appointed and fully equipped with a notebook of every violation she had ever spotted. And she lived 2 houses down from me. The day it all started was, in my mind, completely ordinary. I had just returned from a long day and needed to unload some boxes from my truck. A few were heavy, others awkwardly shaped. Naturally, I pulled my car a little into the street, blocking my own driveway for maybe 10 minutes while I stacked things inside the garage. Simple enough, right? Except in suburban warfare, simplicity is never an option. I was halfway through arranging a particularly stubborn box when I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. Karen. She was marching toward me, brisk and deliberate, her shoes crunching on the gravel with the kind of precision only someone who watches too many reality shows could muster. Her face was red, her eyebrows knotted into a permanent scowl, and she was muttering to herself so loudly that I could hear every word. At first I chuckled. Overreacting again, I thought. She always did this. Neighbors had learned to walk on eggshells around her, but I had my own strategy: observe, endure, and never show frustration. It had worked countless times before. But this time, Karen was storming straight toward my driveway, waving her arms like she was conducting an orchestra of outrage. "You can't block the driveway," she shouted the moment she was within earshot. "This is a violation of the HOA regulations. I'm calling the board and the police if you don't move your car immediately." I smiled politely, the kind of smile you reserve for someone who is about to make a fool of themselves. "I'm just unloading boxes," I said calmly. "It'll be a few minutes." Her face turned an even brighter shade of red. "A few minutes? That's not acceptable. Do you even know what rules you're breaking? Fines will be issued, complaints will be filed, and—" She paused dramatically, scanning for witnesses. "You will be held accountable." I let her continue. In my mind, this was like watching a sitcom unfold in slow motion. She had no idea who she was dealing with. She didn't know that I had spent years in positions where calm under pressure wasn't just recommended, it was mandatory. She didn't know that I could read a situation in a second and act decisively, without raising my voice or spilling a drop of sweat. She saw only a man standing in his driveway, smiling politely, refusing to flinch under her fury. I considered stepping aside, moving the car immediately, but then a thought struck me. Let her call the cops. Let her escalate. There was a strange satisfaction in knowing that this suburban storm had no idea it was standing in the presence of someone who had handled far worse. Plus, it made for excellent entertainment. She pulled out her phone with trembling hands, dialing the number she clearly had memorized for emergencies of this magnitude. "Yes, hello, I need to report a violation. Yes, a blocked driveway. Yes, right now." Her voice pitched higher with every word. I didn't interrupt. I didn't smile too widely. I simply kept arranging the boxes, calm as a monk while the storm raged just a few feet away. Neighbors began to peek from behind curtains and through windows, their curiosity piqued. I could almost hear their thoughts. What on earth is going on? One kid even leaned over the fence, whispering excitedly to another. Karen spotted them, ignored them, and continued her dramatic performance. I paused, resting a hand on my hip, and allowed myself a small chuckle. There it was again, the absurdity of it all. A minor temporary driveway block had unleashed Karen's full arsenal of rules, threats, and indignation, and she didn't know yet that her little complaint was about to meet an unexpected counterforce. I just had to wait for the right moment. Patience was key, and in my line of work, patience wasn't just a virtue, it was a weapon. And so, with the boxes stacked and Karen mid-rant, I leaned slightly against the car, smiled politely, and let the suspense build. She had no idea what was coming, and the scene was only just beginning. Karen didn't waste a second. As soon as she realized I wasn't going to move my car immediately, she launched into full-on lecture mode. "Do you even know what you're doing?" she demanded, arms flailing. Blocking a driveway, even temporarily, is a serious violation. This is exactly why the HOA exists, to keep people like you in check. I stayed calm, keeping my tone neutral, my hands relaxed by my sides. I could almost hear the inner monologue forming in my mind. Congratulations, Karen, you've officially turned a 10-minute unloading into a 5-alarm emergency. Neighbors continued to peek through blinds, some trying not to laugh, others wide-eyed at the unfolding drama. I wondered how long it would take before someone would spill popcorn across the street. You can't just do whatever you want, she continued, shaking her finger at me like a drill sergeant who had lost all reason. I'm calling the board, filing a complaint, and if necessary, the police will come. She sounded triumphant, as if she had just won the lottery. I smiled politely and said, I'm just moving some boxes into my garage. It'll be done in a few minutes. Her face turned bright red, her lips forming a tight line. A few minutes? That is completely unacceptable. A violation is a violation. Do you even understand the consequences? Fines, legal action, citations. She broke off mid-sentence, glancing at the phone in her hand like it was the most powerful weapon on earth. She dialed 911 with trembling hands, giving the dispatcher a very dramatic account of the emergency. I couldn't help but notice the way she exaggerated every detail. My driveway was temporarily blocked. There were no hostages, no fires, and yet she spoke as though the neighborhood was under siege. I leaned casually against my car, still smiling, and let her do her thing. In my line of work, patience is more than a virtue. It is a tool. I had spent years in situations where tension could erupt at any second, where patience determined the outcome. This was nothing compared to those moments, yet Karen treated it like the apocalypse. Neighbors now were fully invested. One teenage boy peeked over the fence, whispering excitedly to his friend, "Is she really calling the cops over a driveway?" I suppressed a laugh. The absurdity of suburban rules versus real-world experience never failed to entertain me. The phone call seemed to drag on forever. Karen's voice rose and fell dramatically as she explained to the dispatcher that someone was blocking their own driveway and refusing to comply with HOA rules. I kept my expression neutral, stacking boxes with careful precision, as if the universe itself had appointed me the calm eye of this storm. After what felt like an eternity, a police car rolled slowly into the street. The officers stepped out, badges gleaming, and approached the scene cautiously. Karen practically bounced with excitement, ready to present her case to the authorities. She pointed at me and began her dramatic explanation, waving her arms and talking over herself. "Officers, this person has blocked his own driveway. He refuses to comply. I am a concerned neighbor trying to uphold the rules." I greeted the officers politely, giving them my full attention while letting the humor of the situation play out. "Good evening, officers. I was just unloading boxes. It'll be finished shortly," I said calmly, my voice steady and composed. The cops exchanged glances, trying to process what was happening. They were professional, polite, and clearly a little confused. After all, the situation involved a driveway, a few boxes, and one extremely agitated neighbor. It wasn't the kind of emergency they usually handled. Karen's excitement peaked, and she began citing every rule she could think of, reciting regulations with a fervor I had only seen in serious legal depositions. The tension in the air was palpable, but I stayed calm, letting it build. The suspense was delicious. She had no idea she was dealing with someone who could control the situation entirely without raising a voice. As I stacked the final box, I realized it was the perfect moment. Karen thought she had the upper hand, the cops thought they understood the situation, and yet none of them had any idea who I really was. A little patience, a little calm, and a dash of humor had created a perfect storm, and the climax was just around the corner. I stepped back from the car, letting the final box slide into place and straightened up. The cops waited for me to move the vehicle. Karen waited for me to show fear. And I waited quietly for the moment to reveal that sometimes appearances can be deceiving, and calm authority can be far more powerful than shouting or fines. The cops were finally on the scene, and Karen's excitement reached a new level. She practically glowed with self-importance, like she had single-handedly saved the neighborhood from disaster. One officer, a tall man with a calm demeanor, stepped forward and spoke first. "Sir, we received a call about a blocked driveway," he said, eyes flicking briefly to me. "Yes, officers," I replied calmly. "I'm just unloading some boxes into my garage. It'll be finished in a few minutes." Karen jumped in immediately, waving her arms. "See, he refuses to comply. This is exactly why rules exist. Do you know how many violations he's committing? He's breaking the HOA regulations as we speak." I glanced at the officers, letting the humor of the situation sink in. One of them raised an eyebrow, clearly trying to figure out if she was serious. The other scribbled notes in his little notepad, probably wondering why suburban drama had escalated to police involvement. As Karen rambled on, I decided to play my part perfectly. Calm, polite, and nonchalant. My tone said, "You're standing in my driveway, yelling at me, while I calmly unload my truck, and yes, I am fully aware of what I am doing." The officers noticed it too. The contrast between my composure and Karen's frantic energy was unmistakable. "Ma'am," I said gently, turning slightly to Karen, "I understand your concern, but I'm only blocking my own driveway temporarily. It will be cleared in a few minutes. There's really no need for the police to get involved." Her response was instant, frantic, and theatrical. "No, this is a serious violation. You can't just block a driveway. You're undermining the integrity of our community. We have rules, and they must be enforced." The officers exchanged glances again. I could sense their internal dialogue. Is this really a priority? Is she overreacting? The tension between suburban perfection and reality was almost comical. I fought the urge to smirk. One of the officers stepped closer and asked me a few routine questions, my name, address, and whether I was moving anything hazardous. I answered politely, giving short, calm responses. Nothing in my tone suggested tension, yet every word carried quiet authority. Karen noticed this, and for the first time I saw uncertainty creep into her expression. "You see," she said, ignoring the officer's questions, "he is completely uncooperative. This is exactly the kind of behavior the HOA is supposed to prevent." I chuckled silently to myself. She had no idea she was performing for the wrong audience. The officers were polite but alert now. My calmness was unnerving. I knew from experience that someone who thinks they are in control can unravel quickly when faced with quiet, deliberate composure. Karen was teetering on that edge. As I placed the last box in the garage, I took a step back and let my body language convey confidence and authority. No shouting, no threats, just quiet assurance. Karen noticed it immediately and flinched slightly. She didn't know why, but something about me unsettled her. The officers noticed too. They were beginning to question if this violation was actually a violation at all. One of them cleared his throat. "Ma'am, I think he's just moving his boxes. Maybe this isn't a serious problem." Karen's jaw dropped. She looked at me as if expecting me to panic, apologize, or bolt. Instead, I smiled politely and said, "Everything will be cleared in a moment. I promise there's no danger or violation beyond this temporary inconvenience." Her face turned even redder, and she looked like a volcano ready to erupt. Neighbors peeked out again, whispering excitedly about the spectacle. One even muttered to another, "Is she really acting like this over a driveway?" I let the moment stretch just long enough to maximize suspense. Karen's frantic energy was my entertainment, and the tension in the air was palpable. It was like watching a storm build, knowing exactly when the lightning would strike, but letting it simmer for just a few more seconds. As the officers began to discuss quietly among themselves, Karen continued to argue, unaware that her complaints were losing credibility by the second. The neighborhood held its collective breath. Everyone could sense that something was about to happen, though no one yet knew what. The cops were waiting for instructions, Karen was waiting for compliance, and I was just waiting for the perfect moment to tip the balance entirely in my favor. And deep down, I knew it wouldn't just be about a driveway anymore. This was about patience, control, and letting the truth reveal itself without ever raising my voice. The calm before the storm had reached its peak, and soon, Karen's world was about to change forever. As Karen ranted, waving her arms like she was conducting a symphony of outrage, I couldn't help but reflect on my own background. Years of training, years of leadership under pressure, and years of staying calm while chaos erupted around me had prepared me for moments like this. And yet here I was, facing suburban warfare over a driveway. I had seen storms far worse, situations where the outcome meant life or death. This was nothing, and the humor of it struck me instantly. I could see the neighbors peeking through blinds and over fences, whispering, pointing, and probably placing bets on who would break first. HOAKaren, oblivious, was giving the performance of her life. Every complaint she voiced, every rule she recited made her feel powerful. I let her feel that power. It made the eventual reveal all the sweeter. The officers were still standing there, politely trying to maintain authority, glancing at one another with that unmistakable look of uncertainty. It was clear to me that they were beginning to question the seriousness of the situation. In one hand, they had a frantic neighbor insisting there was an emergency. In the other, a calm homeowner politely explaining that it was just a temporary driveway block. The contrast was almost cinematic. HOAKaren's voice cracked as she leaned closer. "This is unacceptable. You can't just decide for yourself. The rules exist for a reason: fines, penalties, community standards." She glanced around, desperate for validation, but the officers were not nodding in her favor. My lips twitched with suppressed amusement. She had no idea she was about to collide with a kind of authority she could not comprehend. I decided to let her take it a step further. I didn't need to shout, threaten, or escalate. I simply let my calmness be louder than her hysteria. I stood straight, my shoulders relaxed, my gaze steady. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but in my line of work, subtle signals can change everything. HOAKaren noticed it immediately and faltered. She didn't understand why she suddenly felt small, why her anger seemed ineffective. "Ma'am," one of the officers said cautiously, "perhaps this situation is not as severe as initially reported." HOAKaren gasped, looking like someone had punched her in the chest. "Not severe," she sputtered. "He's blocking his own driveway. It's an affront to every resident. It's an emergency." She waved her hands dramatically. The officers tried not to smile. I fought the urge to chuckle outright. As the tension mounted, I began to casually drop subtle hints about my past, nothing overt, just a mention of responsibilities, leadership, and years of handling delicate situations. Each phrase was designed to create curiosity, to make the officers and even HOAKaren subconsciously realize that there was more here than met the eye. Her disbelief began to creep in. She tilted her head slightly, trying to reconcile the calm demeanor in front of her with the chaos in her mind. The humor of the situation was impossible to ignore. Here was a woman who had built her entire self-image around rules, violations, and community policing, standing in front of someone who could remain unshaken while the world literally burned around him. She had no idea that patience and composure could be more terrifying than shouting or threatening fines. Neighbors now were leaning out of windows, whispers spreading across the street. "Is he military?" one kid whispered. "He looks like he knows what he's doing." I caught a glimpse of a neighbor smirking, hiding their laughter behind a curtain. Suspense hung in the air thickly as everyone watched, waiting for something to happen. HOAKaren took a deep breath, trying to regain control, but it was too late. The officers were no longer giving her full attention, and the subtle tension in my posture suggested authority. I had the calm, I had the control, and she had no idea how quickly the tables could turn. The suspense was delicious, and the moment was perfectly set. And yet I waited. Patience, I reminded myself, is the ultimate weapon. HOAKaren didn't know who I was, the officers didn't yet understand my background, and the neighborhood was watching. Every second that passed increased the suspense, making the eventual revelation even more satisfying. She thought she was winning, but in reality, she was one step away from realizing that sometimes, calm and quiet authority can dismantle drama without a single raised voice. The stage was set. The actors were in place. HOAKaren, the cops, the neighbors, and I, standing quietly, ready to tip the balance entirely in the next act. The calm before the storm had reached its peak, and soon, what had begun as a trivial driveway blockade would become a lesson in patience, composure, and quiet power. HOAKaren wasn't going to back down. In fact, now that she realized the cops weren't fully on her side, her desperation only grew. She straightened, chest puffed out, and began rattling off every possible consequence she could think of. Fines, legal action, citations, HOA sanctions, community disgrace. she shouted, as if the last one was the ultimate threat. I stayed calm, arms crossed casually, smiling politely. I could feel the tension radiating off her like heat waves on asphalt. Neighbors leaned farther out of windows, whispering, giggling, and secretly enjoying the drama. One teenager even snapped a picture with his phone. I had to stifle a chuckle. Suburban theater at its finest. The officers were watching closely now, clearly confused. One muttered to the other, "Is this really worth our time?" The other nodded slightly, scribbling in his notebook while stealing glances at me. I didn't rush them, didn't pressure them. I let my calmness speak for itself. Authority didn't have to be loud. It simply existed in posture, tone, and presence. Karen stomped closer, pointing her finger at me like she was trying to pierce my calm with sheer force. "Do you realize how serious this is?" she demanded. "The HOA rules exist for a reason. If you don't comply, we could take action against you immediately." I nodded slowly, letting her words wash over me. "I understand your concern," I said, voice steady, "but I am only blocking my own driveway for a few minutes. There is no risk, no threat, and no need for escalation." Her face twitched with disbelief. "No need, you're treating this like a joke," she spat. "Blocking a driveway, however briefly, is a community offense." I smiled faintly. The irony was almost delicious. She thought she had the upper hand because she was louder, more frantic, more visible. She didn't understand that patience, composure, and quiet authority carried more weight than any number of shouted rules or fines. The tension in the air was almost tangible. Neighbors whispered, leaning out their windows, watching Karen escalate while I remained calm. Suspense built naturally as the drama unfolded. Would she finally see reason? Would the cops intervene in her favor? Or would the truth slowly reveal itself in a way no one expected? I noticed Karen packing now, muttering to herself, clearly struggling to regain control. She glanced at the officers, then back at me, trying to rally support. "Officers, you have to enforce the rules," she pleaded, voice cracking slightly. "This is what keeps our neighborhood safe. It's about order. It's about—" She broke off, realizing that her argument was losing traction. The officers exchanged glances again, quietly assessing the situation. One of them stepped closer to me and asked a few questions about the driveway, my intentions, and the boxes. I answered politely, clearly, calmly. Every word reinforced the subtle authority I carried. They began to understand that this wasn't a problem at all, but a minor inconvenience blown out of proportion. Karen's panic grew. She realized the cops weren't going to side with her entirely. Her face turned redder, her gestures became more frantic, and yet she couldn't break through the calm wall I had constructed. The suspense was palpable. The entire neighborhood seemed to hold its breath. Then, in a quiet, deliberate tone, I dropped a small hint about my background, nothing overt, just enough to make the officers pause. "I've handled situations like this many times before," I said softly, my voice calm but firm. "In environments where patience, planning, and authority are far more important than shouting or panic." Karen froze mid-step. She didn't understand what I meant, but something about the confidence in my tone unsettled her. The officers, on the other hand, exchanged subtle glances, curiosity flickering in their eyes. Suspense tightened like a coiled spring. Neighbors whispered excitedly behind closed blinds. The young teenager had stopped recording because the tension was almost unbearable. Karen was flustered, the officers were intrigued, and I stood calmly, letting the drama build naturally. It was the perfect setup. Karen's overconfidence, the cops, uncertainty, and my quiet authority created a pressure cooker of suspense. Every second that passed increased anticipation, making the inevitable revelation of who I really was even more satisfying. And I knew it. Karen thought she was winning, that her rules and theatrics would prevail. She had no idea that her panic and overzealousness were about to collide with experience, authority, and patience. The climax was approaching, and the suburban battlefield had never been more tense. The stage was perfectly set. Karen's dramatic energy was peaked, the cops were questioning, and the neighborhood was watching. All that remained was for the revelation to unfold and for the balance of power to shift entirely. It happened almost casually. Karen had reached the peak of her panic, waving her arms and lecturing like she was defending the entire community single-handedly. The cops were politely trying to mediate, scribbling notes, glancing between us, clearly unsure how to handle a situation that seemed simultaneously trivial and absurd. And I stood there, calm, composed, enjoying the suspense as it built. I decided it was time for a subtle reveal, nothing dramatic yet, just enough to shift the energy. I smiled politely, tilted my head slightly, and mentioned a few responsibilities from my past, casually dropping phrases that hinted at leadership and high-level authority. "I've had to manage complex operations under extreme pressure before," I said evenly. "Patience and planning are often more effective than rushing or shouting." HOAKaren froze mid-gesture. She blinked rapidly, her mind trying to connect the calm, confident man in front of her with the frantic, overzealous neighbor she thought she was dealing with. The officers, now clearly intrigued, exchanged subtle glances. Suspense filled the air like electricity, thick and undeniable. The neighborhood, once just a backdrop, seemed to lean in, every neighbor silently wondering what was going on. Her voice wavered as she asked, "What do you mean by complex operations?" Her fingers trembled as she waved her phone, still half-dialed. She had no idea that her complaints were unraveling before her very eyes. The authority in my tone had begun to pierce through the veil of her overconfidence. I smiled, letting the pause stretch just long enough to increase tension. "I've handled responsibilities that required calm and composure under circumstances where panic could make the difference between success and failure," I said softly. "It's not something most people get to experience, but it teaches you to stay level-headed no matter what." HOAKaren's jaw dropped slightly. She didn't know whether to be impressed, intimidated, or incredulous. The cops leaned in subtly, curiosity overtaking protocol. The suspense was now unbearable, like waiting for a storm to break. Neighbors pressed closer to windows, whispering, their eyes wide. A few even laughed quietly behind their hands, sensing that something monumental was about to occur. Then casually, as if it were the most normal thing in the world, I added, "In fact, the authority I hold comes with experience far beyond just supervising boxes in a driveway." The words were measured, calm, almost teasing. The officers stiffened slightly, a subtle but unmistakable acknowledgement passing between them. HOAKaren froze entirely. Her eyes widened, her mouth opened, then closed, and she stammered, Wait." The moment of revelation struck. The officers now looked at me with a mixture of respect and slight astonishment. HOAKaren's dramatic energy faltered entirely, replaced with confusion and fear. Her overconfidence evaporated in an instant. She had no idea who she had been confronting, no understanding of the authority that radiated from my calm presence. The suspense, the tension, the drama, all reached a peak in that brief, breathtaking moment. Neighbors whispered excitedly, some smiling, some gasping. The teenager filming earlier had put down his phone, eyes wide, realizing he had witnessed something extraordinary. HOAKaren's frantic complaints had no weight against the authority quietly displayed in my demeanor. She sputtered, trying to regain control, but every attempt fell flat. I let the pause linger, allowing her to fully grasp that her assumptions were wrong. Finally, I spoke in a calm, measured voice. "Everything is under control. The boxes are unloaded, the driveway is clear, and no further action is necessary." HOAKaren blinked repeatedly, clearly struggling to process the situation. The officers nodded subtly, acknowledging the truth without saying a word. The suspense shifted, tension replaced by realization. Her panic now mixed with embarrassment, her authority evaporated in the quiet presence of someone who truly understood leadership. Inwardly, I allowed myself a small, private chuckle. The absurdity of the entire situation, the frantic overreaction, the neighborhood spectators, and the cops unsure what to do, was almost too perfect. The suspense had reached its climax, and the reveal had changed the dynamics entirely. HOAKaren finally muttered a half-hearted apology, fumbling with her phone. The officers gave polite nods, reassured but still curious about the calm, commanding presence they had just witnessed. Neighbors whispered, gossip already forming, aware they had just seen something memorable. And I, standing quietly, savored the moment. Patience, subtle authority, and composure had turned what could have been a trivial confrontation into a lesson, a story, and a subtle triumph. The suspense had been worth every second. The aftermath began almost immediately. Karen's dramatic energy had collapsed, leaving her flustered and unsure. She muttered half-hearted apologies, waved her phone, and finally retreated down the sidewalk, as if she had been caught in the middle of a storm she couldn't control. Neighbors peeked through windows, some giggling, others wide-eyed, as the tension slowly dissolved. I watched her go, arms crossed casually, pretending not to notice the subtle victory. In my mind, I replayed the scene, the frantic gestures, the wild accusations, the absolute collapse of her confidence. It was almost cinematic, and the humor of the entire situation wasn't lost on me. Suburban drama had met quiet authority, and authority had won without a single raised voice. The officers remained, quietly exchanging glances. One of them gave a small nod, acknowledging that what they had just witnessed was far from ordinary. The other scribbled something in his notebook, probably trying to capture the absurdity for future reference. I smiled politely, keeping my tone neutral, giving nothing away, letting them digest the revelation without fanfare. Karen's retreat left a ripple of whispers through the neighborhood. Doors opened slightly, blinds parted, and soon, small clusters of neighbors gathered quietly, talking in low voices. The story was already spreading. Someone whispered to another, "Did you see what just happened? She actually called the cops over a driveway, and he just handled it." Laughter mixed with awe as people recounted the confrontation from their vantage points. I decided to let the neighborhood gossip work in my favor. There was no need to brag, no need to escalate further. My calm demeanor had spoken louder than words, and letting others tell the story made it more satisfying. Karen had underestimated me, and everyone was now quietly aware of the consequence of overstepping. A few minutes later, the teenager who had been filming earlier approached me cautiously. "Sir, that was incredible. She had no idea," he whispered, still wide-eyed. I smiled, ruffling his hair gently. "Sometimes the quiet approach is the most effective," I said softly. "Suspense and drama don't always need volume. Patience and composure carry more weight than shouting." Karen, meanwhile, had gone inside her house, presumably to rethink every decision that led her to this moment. Her face probably matched the red of her car by now. The humor in the situation wasn't lost on me. Her entire persona, built on control and authority, had been dismantled by a calm voice and measured presence. The suspense had turned into satisfaction. Over the next few days, the neighborhood quietly reacted. Some neighbors approached me politely, complimenting my composure, whispering about how they had never seen someone handle a situation so calmly. Others laughed quietly, recounting Karen's dramatic performance and her complete inability to maintain authority in the presence of someone who truly understood command. HOA meetings became a subtle battlefield as well. Karen approached cautiously, noticeably more subdued. Her attempts at asserting dominance were met with polite nods, quiet confidence, or gentle reminders of reality. She had learned the hard way that overzealous theatrics have limits when confronted with true authority. Humor remained an undercurrent throughout the neighborhood. People recounted the driveway incident in whispers and chuckles, turning it into a legendary tale of patience, control, and subtle power. Karen became a cautionary tale for overstepping, while my calm presence became quietly respected. Suspense had evolved into quiet admiration, and the neighborhood's dynamics shifted subtly but irreversibly. Inwardly, I reflected on the lesson. Patience, composure, and a quiet sense of authority can resolve conflicts more effectively than anger, fines, or dramatics. Letting people reveal themselves through their actions often accomplishes more than trying to enforce rules with noise or threat. Karen had revealed her limits, the cops had witnessed real authority, and the neighborhood had learned an unspoken truth about power and restraint. As I stood in my driveway, boxes unloaded and car moved, the suspense of the confrontation faded, replaced by satisfaction. The humor, the drama, and the lesson lingered in the air like the last notes of a symphony. Suburban life continued, but the legend of that day quietly grew, whispered from one neighbor to another, a reminder that calm, patience, and quiet authority can change the course of even the most absurd conflict. And for once, the neighborhood had a story worth talking about. In the days that followed, the neighborhood slowly returned to its usual rhythm, but the echoes of the driveway incident lingered. Whispers behind curtains, subtle nods on the sidewalk, and quiet chuckles became the new soundtrack of suburban life. HOAKaren, once the unchallenged queen of HOA enforcement, moved cautiously now, her gestures smaller, her words less forceful. The shift was subtle, but everyone noticed. I kept to my routines, unloading groceries, tending the garden, and occasionally waving to neighbors who offered polite smiles or subdued thumbs up. There was humor in their eyes, a shared acknowledgement of the absurdity they had all witnessed. They didn't need me to explain. The story had already taken on a life of its own, growing larger in every retelling. Suspense lingered in conversations, and everyone seemed to enjoy the subtle thrill of knowing that I had quietly turned the tables on the most overzealous resident in the neighborhood. HOAKaren tried, of course, to regain some semblance of authority. She brought up trivial violations during HOA meetings, sent passive-aggressive notes about garden aesthetics, and attempted subtle digs about parking, but nothing stuck. The calm authority I had demonstrated that day carried more weight than her theatrics ever could. Neighbors noticed, and even the cops who had been called that day seemed to exchange knowing smiles when she overstepped. The suspense had shifted from confrontation to quiet observation. I found humor in it all. It was almost surreal to think that a simple driveway blockade could escalate to such a legendary tale. I often laughed quietly to myself, imagining HOAKaren packing, muttering under her breath, realizing that the rules she cherished were powerless against calm, measured authority. The entire episode had become a subtle comedy, a reminder that overconfidence often meets quiet strength in the most unexpected ways. The neighborhood children even began whispering about the driveway incident, sharing exaggerated versions of the story like urban legend. "He's calm, he's fearless, and he doesn't yell," one whispered to another. "He made HOAKaren look silly." Their laughter and awe carried a subtle lesson. Sometimes true strength is quiet, almost invisible, yet unmistakable in effect. HOA meetings became less about fear and compliance and more about collaboration. HOAKaren's voice, once booming and commanding, became hesitant and polite. Neighbors approached me cautiously at first, sharing concerns or suggestions, but always with respect. The humor of the situation was never far away. People occasionally smirked as they recounted the tale of the driveway, the boxes, and the moment HOAKaren realized she had underestimated me. One afternoon, as I watered my garden, a neighbor walked over and asked quietly, "You handled that so calmly. Was it your training?" I smiled, replying simply, "Patience, composure, and knowing when to let others reveal themselves is more powerful than raising your voice." The lesson was subtle, the humor intact, and the suspense lingering even in everyday life. HOAKaren, for her part, learned a hard truth. Authority without respect, rules without understanding, and drama without perspective are fragile. Her attempts at influence became tempered with caution, her overzealousness softened by the memory of that day. The neighborhood, once tense under her rule, began to breathe easier. Laughter returned, conversations resumed, and suburban life regained its rhythm, now flavored with subtle amusement and shared admiration. Reflecting on the entire experience, I realized how much suspense, humor, and patience can shape a story. What began as a minor inconvenience, a few boxes blocking a driveway, transformed into a lesson about human behavior, perception, and authority. The climax of the confrontation was a revelation not just for HOAKaren, but for everyone watching. Calm, measured composure is often more powerful than noise, fines, or theatrics. And so the driveway incident became legend. Whispered in hallways, recounted behind curtains, and remembered with laughter, it taught a simple truth. Patience and quiet authority can triumph over panic and drama, leaving a lasting impression that words alone cannot capture. Suburban life continued, but the story remained, a subtle mix of humor, suspense, and triumph that would be remembered long after the boxes were unloaded and the driveway cleared. In the end, the neighborhood learned an unspoken lesson. HOAKaren learned it the hardest way, and I learned that sometimes the most satisfying victories are quiet, patient, and invisible to those who expect chaos to make the rules. The calm had won, the drama had faded, and the story had become something everyone could smile about. And that, in the end, was worth more than any fine, complaint, or rule could ever be. You've heard this confession, now wait until you hear the next one, the truth that shatters everything you thought you knew.